Oh, hello, guys. Well, I'm ready here, and I hope you will be ready soon. I don't see anyone connected right now, but anyway, it's a bit early. So I hope you're coping well with the new circumstances that are kind of strange, exceptional, um, certainly unexpected for our term. So we'll try to make the best of it. Oh, I see someone who is connected now. All right, it's 2 p.m. Let's get started. So, this is the first time I do this, teaching online, and it's kind of strange not seeing you, not seeing the reactions to whatever I say. I'm just hoping that I will be able to deliver the contents anyway, and please feel free to ask questions or add comments in the chat room. It is there. You can send them anytime. I could kind of answer the questions right away, or we can kind of redirect our conversation according to those questions or comments. So it's too bad I can't have your live voice. This is the most simple, straightforward platform I could find. So hopefully it'll be okay for the moment. Okay. We're going to do this exercise again this coming Tuesday, March 24th, at the same time at 2 p.m. So you can, get prepared for that, do the readings, and I'm also expecting that. Who is going to send their PowerPoint presentation? Kale. Kale is going to send that presentation ideally on Tuesday, so people can have access to it um, right away. Um, by the way, Peyton already sent his slides. They are uploaded in the eClass site. You can consult them anytime you want, and perhaps also Peyton, if he is listening, if he will get connected, will also be able to answer any questions you may have to make those slides more useful for your study purposes. Because I noticed that there are plenty of interesting graphs that he found. So if he can tell us about the sources, about the meaning of them, um, that would be extremely useful. Okay, Kale has just sent me a message telling that he will be sending his presentation by Tuesday. So this is great. That way we will be able to use it for the lecture. So take note then. Uh, we have an appointment Tuesday at 2 to continue with this strange yet good replacement of live lectures. Okay, so let's get started. This is the point where I would ask all of you to tell me what is the main thesis of the first reading, which is, of course, chapter, what number is that? Chapter 8 in our textbook. But because you're not here to answer, well, I will simply say what is the main thesis there. The main thesis could be kind of condensed in a single phrase. The market alone is unable to solve inequality, right? That the assumptions of trickle down economic growth don't work. At least they haven't worked in Latin America. So there is always a need for a decisive, explicit, uh, directed intervention of the states to fight against inequality. And that intervention has been made in some countries that are going to be explored here. Uh, Otherwise, inequality will keep growing. Capitalism is not a system that is designed to distribute wealth. It is a system that is designed to accumulate wealth. So if there is no intervention of the states for the sake of public interest, for promoting some type of redistribution, sometimes of social justice, then simply that redistribution, that inequality will not diminish. So the two cases that are analyzed as evidence for this, for showing this, for supporting this statement are Brazil and Costa Rica. Brazil, well, it's a country that has provided many valuable lessons, and once again, we're going to see that the country is this country is giving teaching us another lesson, a lesson, of course, that is currently challenged by the new right-wing government, as we mentioned last week. But nonetheless, it stays in the record as a very interesting example of what can be done to fight against inequality. So for a long time, Brazil, economic policymakers in Brazil believed in what's it called, the Kuznets curve. Simon Kuznets, an economist, that suggested in a very influential theory in the 1950s, created in the 1950s, that it wasn't a big problem if inequality increased over time in periods of economic growth. That you may expect that when a country is growing, when in a pace of economic development, accelerated pace of economic development, you may expect that the gaps between the rich and the poor are going to increase, are going to enlarge. But this is okay. It is normal because in time, this very same economic growth will lead to a distribution of that wealth, and therefore it's just a matter of focusing your attention on promoting more growth, and eventually everyone in a country will benefit from that growth. So the famous Kuznets curve that results from this theory is the following. So in the vertical axis, you have inequality, and on the horizontal axis, you have economic growth. So the idea of this graph is that the more economic growth advances at initial stages, inequality is going to grow. But over time, as soon as economic growth reaches a certain inflection point, then economic growth will continue, but inequality will decrease. So governments don't have to worry, policymakers don't have to worry about doing anything about inequality, because it is going to naturally decrease over time. And this was not only believed by Brazil, but by most countries in Latin America, that as long as you promote economic growth, as long as you contribute to expanding capitalism, eventually the economy, the market itself, will lift everyone's boats, right? As a result of this approach that was adopted in the 1950s, was carried on by the military governments starting in 1964. By 1989, that is to say, a few years after the end of the military government in 1984, the Gini coefficient for Brazil was 0.66. You might remember that the Gini coefficient is a measurement of the concentration of income in a given country, and that if everyone got exactly the same income, the Gini coefficient would be zero. But if only one person accumulated all of the GDP in one country, that would be a Gini coefficient or one, sometimes 100. Different literature uses the index differently. But the point is that the Gini coefficient for Brazil in 1989 was 0.66, which is very high for global standards. And this also meant that 40% of the population in that country lived in poverty, right? Uh, over over one third, sorry, of the population of Brazil uh, was living in in uh, in poverty. And this, even though Brazil had been through a long period going from 1960 to 1994 through what was called the Brazilian miracle by economists around the world. Uh, Brazilian miracle meant sustained period of economic growth that was, hailed by the World Bank and other international financial institutions as an example to the rest of the world. And Brazilian policymakers firmly believed in this Kuznets curve approach. Uh, Therefore, there was a minimum intervention of the state in conducting economic growth. Uh, this approach was implemented, the authors of our textbook say, by Carlos Langoni, a Brazilian economist that had been trained at the University of Chicago. Not surprisingly, the University of Chicago is the cradle, or one of the cradles, I should say, of neoliberalism in the world, and the main kind of export institution of neoliberalism to Latin America. Uh, and, uh, you know, for them, what mattered for Carlos Langoni and other policymakers, what mattered in uh, promoting economic growth was, just growth per se, believing that eventually it will benefit everyone. Uh, as I said a minute ago, the military endorsed this approach that was originally adopted by civilian governments, but after the military coup in 1964, the military just carry on with that one. In this approach, in the Kuznets curve approach, there was this implicit belief that um, uh, any country, any capitalist country, will follow the path that had been um, made by Europe and North America in the 19th century, where economic growth, economic expansion was accompanied by huge inequalities, but eventually those inequalities went down. Uh, so in this period from 1960 to 1994, the per capita average income grew in Brazil 256%, so a huge growth, but it is an average. That's what is interesting here, because the benefits of this growth never really reached the majority of the people in that country. You might remember when we were discussing um, the policies to accommodate or to provide social justice to Black minorities in that country, the the conditions under which these people live in the country. So that impoverishment was to a large extent the result of this approach of promoting economic growth but not equality. One infamous quote mentioned by one government official in the country was the following: Brazil is doing fine. It's the people who are doing poorly. This understanding or assumption that what mattered was the growth of the economy and not whether individual people were benefiting from it. But there was eventually a change of direction that, as many of the things that we have been discussing in this course was gradual. Eventually, changed the situation. 1985, you already know, Brazil put an end to military government. 1988, adoption of a new constitution, very expansive constitution, granting and protecting socioeconomic rights. And in 1994, something more important occurred. Fernando Henrique Cardoso, a social democrat, who was also one of the fathers of uh, the figureheads of the dependence theory, was elected to the presidency. Uh, and he decided to change this approach um, of promoting only economic growth by combining things that were not necessarily that the theory didn't indicate that they should be combined. Trade liberalization, so market opportunities for corporations, but also an increase of taxation for corporations and the better off in Brazilian society, and progressive social policies. Um, so thanks to the policies put in place by Cardoso, the poverty in Brazil was reduced um, from 17% of the population in 1990 to 6.1% of the Brazilian population in 2009. There were three basic um, pillars or three basic ingredients to this kind of fight against poverty, fight against inequality. The first one was the investment in basic education, uh, which meant a huge leap in the quality of the education offered in that country in only 10 years. This meant the equalization of funding for education across the country that was tied to the number of students that every school was enrolling. So there was an incentive incorporated into the system to uh, increase enrollment, incentive to schools, that is, to increase their enrollment. The second ingredient, the second pillar of this progressive social policy approach was the establishment of conditional cash transfers, called in the literature the CCT. Conditional cash transfers are public money, public subsidies that are given directly to individuals in exchange for some type of behavior that the government wants them uh, to have, like sending their children to school, uh, going to regular checkups with the healthcare provider. And this was, in the end, directed especially to poorer families that, in an effort to uh, encourage them to give a better education, better opportunities to their children, and in the end, give them tools to escape poverty in the future. Um, this program that was started by Cardoso, uh, reaching only students that were attending school, was expanded in 2007 by the Workers' Party government led by Lula, Luis Inácio Lula da Silva, the president 2 terms, to include the whole family. It was renamed Bolsa Familia, so family scholarship, and the transfer was made directly to debit cards, um, and it was including subsidies for food and energy, also aimed at the poorer families. Uh, this program of conditional cash transfer, the CCT, was praised worldwide as an effective way to fight poverty. It was followed by the Mexican government and even by the New York City government that started giving subsidies to poor people. So this is an example of how some policies that have proven successful in Latin America have had an impact even in the global north. Over time, 12 Latin American countries implemented some form of conditional cash transfer, as I said, including Mexico. At the present time, the left wing government in Mexico has made this program of CCT almost universal, and it is less conditional because, for instance, there is a subsidy for older people, for elderly citizens, that is not conditioned to anything really other than being older than 60 years old. There are scholarships given to high school students, um, to peasants, agricultural workers, and so on and so forth. So this subsidies that are not really, you know, playing the rules of capitalism, money given directly to people, are nonetheless quite effective at fighting inequality. So we said that the first government was investing in education. The second pillar was conditional cash transfer, and the third pillar of this poverty reduction strategy was increasing minimum wages. Right. The first rule of this increase of minimum wages is that it has to be above inflation levels and correspond to the productivity, or that is to say, the value that the workers are adding to the services or goods that they are producing. Uh, so this raise in minimum wages was strongly opposed by orthodox economists that believe that if you increase the minimum wage, then all the prices will rise, and this will lead to inflation. But in reality, it only promoted the expansion of the market and increased the numbers of employed people and the number of formal jobs. So it turned out to be a beneficial program, a beneficial policy for pulling people out of poverty, and it ended up benefiting everyone, right? With the market expansion. This is something that we also saw happening here in Alberta, with the controversial increase of minimum wages uh, to workers that previous conservative governments were opposing because they were saying, they were assuming that it would only uh, in, increase inflation, drive small businesses out of business, but in the end, it resulted in the expansion of the domestic market and was good for everyone. So, as a result of this combined effect of these three policies, the poverty rate in Brazil was halved in 10 years, and it made possible that that country reached the Millennium Development Goals set by the United Nations in the specific aspect of inequality 10 years earlier than planned. So the Brazilian example has shown that it is possible to grow and redistribute at the same time, uh, as long as you don't leave distribution to the market. On page 134, there is kind of an abstract of what I'm trying to say. Um, the secret of Brazil is that there is growth for all, but government policies favor the growth of the poor. It is a tale of two Americas. One in the north has the rich getting richer faster. That's the US, of course. In South America, Brazil is seeing the opposite happen. The poor are getting richer faster. So this is, I guess, the lesson from Latin America that we get from Brazil once again. But Brazil is not the only country that has adopted this type of policies that has effectively fought against inequality. There is another country that, for a long time, ignored the assumptions of the Kuznets curve that growth is enough to fight inequality, and that decided early on to implement policies to fight against inequality, to fight against poverty, and that country is Costa Rica. We know Costa Rica when we discuss demilitarization that it has shown for the past 70 years a very progressive policy making that started with the elimination of the army in 1948, but that has also practiced the implementation of a welfare state that is much more comprehensive than in most countries in Latin America. Uh, so over the first 24 years after the elimination of the army, the Costa Rica's Gini coefficient dropped from close to zero point 0.5 to 0.42, which is still high for global standards, but that is very good for Latin American standards. And this is due to the development of the welfare state, a very muscular intervention of the state in trying to level the playing field for everyone, providing education services, health, and other social services to the population. So the reading tells us that in 1958, as early as 1958, 45% of the public budget went to spent on education, health, and social services. And in 1976, 30%. This is very, very high if you compare to most Western countries. And this has obviously made it easier thanks to the elimination of the army. Also, the Costa Rican government has decided to adopt kind of unorthodox, not very conventional economic policies, such as a huge intervention, very kind of directive intervention of the government in the management of foreign national banks. Those national banks provide a credit for cooperatives, export and social programs that what to do affordable interest rates with not many strings attached. In other words, they want to break the cycle of commercial banking that is making it difficult for small companies to get necessary financing for their projects. Also, the Costa Rican government created what is called the Basic Health Attention Teams. The acronym in Spanish for that is EBAIS, EBAIS. This is a system for healthcare delivery that attempts to live to four basic principles: universality, solidarity. Solidarity meaning universal contribution, everyone pays the same, even if they don't take much advantage of it. Equity, and there is a subsidy in this system. So the eBay system has created a network of clinics that serve basic needs where everyone goes. There is an efficient public health delivery system, and only patients that are in need of more specialized care are referred to hospitals. But everyone goes to the eBay clinic first. As a result, surprisingly, in 2012, Costa Rica had a higher life expectancy than the US or even Denmark, countries like Denmark. Investment in education meant, of course, that uh, a better human capital was available, that Costa Rican people were more competitive, that foreign investors could count on the population of that country to fulfill more sophisticated jobs. And as a result, well, Costa Rica became a center for research and development innovation in uh, in Latin America. Very much following the example of the so-called Asian tigers that also invested heavily in education to make their workforce more specialized, more um, uh, competitive internationally. Another idea or another policy that the Costa Rican government put in place is to uh, invest in tourism infrastructure organization, campaigns for bringing international tourism to the country, uh, on the premise that tourism had to benefit as many Costa Ricans as possible. So forget about that system that exists in so many countries, especially in the Caribbean, where there are foreign companies that invest, create resorts, create kind of tourist infrastructure. But because they are foreign, most of the profit goes back to the country of origin, United States, Spain, France. Those are kind of the um, tourist companies' powerhouses. In Costa Rica is different. There is this requirement that any tourist project has to find their suppliers locally, uh, for food, for of course employment, for other uh, things, other stuff that is needed for serving tourists. And this requirement allows for the creation of supply chains that, in the end, benefit many Costa Ricans instead of just the foreign investors. So very early on, then Costa Rica put into doubt or into question the assumptions of the Kuznets curve, and implemented very muscular policies for combating inequality, giving the population better tools for uh, being prepared for the market. So, in a way, Brazil followed on the path of what that Costa Rica had showed that it worked. Uh, and as a result, after a period of total uh, disagreement, on page 135 of your textbook, the Gini coefficient of the two countries converged in 2010, right? So there's a huge spike in inequality that Brazil knew at the end of the 1980s was gradually decreasing. And yes, Costa Rican inequality grew a little bit in the early 2000s, but never reaching the point where I think would be if a more decisive welfare policies uh, were not adopted. So this is the chapter, the things that I consider to be most relevant in the chapter. Maybe you have questions or comments. Remember that you can type your questions in the chat room at any moment. So so we can kind of direct the conversation along the lines that you tell me. Okay, um, let's move to the following reading. As I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation. Peyton has already um, sent me his slides, PowerPoint slides that he was going to use for his presentation in class. They are already available in the e-class page for our course, so you can check them. And I'm hoping that Peyton will agree to answer any questions you may have. If he does, I will share his email address so you can ask about the graphs in particular. But the main purpose of that reading, it is an interview with an World Bank official that talks about the general trends existing in Latin America at the beginning of the 21st century. Um, the interview is with one of the authors of a World Bank report called Wage Inequality in Latin America. And he says very straightforwardly that Latin America and the Caribbean is the only region in the world that where inequality decreased over the past few years. He is referring to the period 2004 2015. Uh, and to him, it was an exciting news because it shows that you can have both. You can at the same time promote economic growth and equality. That those two goals don't have to be different from each other. You can act on both fronts and being equally successful. Uh, he discusses some of the elements, some of the reasons why uh, this inequality has been successfully uh, confronted. One of them is wage increases, as you know, our textbook mentioned. The other one is the CCT, the conditional cash transfer programs that also our textbook mentioned. But he adds other elements that need to be taken into account. The first one is the expansion of pension coverage. So, of course, the more people are able to retire with a decent pension, living pension, the more it adds to the welfare of their families. And the other element that this reading adds is that some demographic changes in the household, the average household in Latin America, have also contributed to decreasing inequality. Specifically, he is referring to smaller families that have more disposable income for their needs. Uh, this reduction of inequality was more noticeable in South America than it was in Central America or Mexico. Nonetheless, the general trend of the region is there. So the reasons that he's offering for explaining this decline of inequality are several. The first one is economic growth. Economic growth is important if you want to decrease inequality. If you want to share the economic pie, well, that pie has to grow. It is obvious. Um, Economic growth in the first years of the 21st century in Latin America was, to a large extent, driven by uh, the commodity boom, the demand that some of the raw materials that are produced in the region, copper, uh, natural gas, oil, um, uh, was having in uh, international markets, in particular in China. This is what promoted the success of some governments in the area: Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, Peru. Um, and this commodity boom also favored some activities that had to be carried out in the country, such as construction, transportation, tourism. Uh, that in turn created more employment and lower wage inequality. Uh, the author of this, or the person answering to the interview, acknowledges that this kind of inequality may be fight against inequality, sorry, may be fragile because as soon as economic growth uh, slows down, well, the fight against inequality is compromised. The other element, the other kind of root or source of decrease inequality is the expansion of education. So as you can see, there is a good kind of conversation between our textbook and this reading because there are many overlaps. The expansion of education meant that the so-called the reduction of the so-called college premium. That is to say that people who go to university have a much higher income. Now it is, of course, people who have a professional education have a larger income, but this income is not as different as it was at the end of the 20th century. Uh, Expansion of education meant that the rising of minimum wages was sustainable, uh, a reduction of informal sector jobs, and also a decreased experience premium that people didn't have to rely on their experience alone for finding profitable jobs. So at the end of the interviewed um, the interviewer asked, "What is to be done to maintain this trend?" And the expert says that there are two things that that need to be basically made. First, support productivity growth uh, by not supporting inefficient firms, letting the market kill those firms that are non-viable, that are non-profitable enough, um, while at the same time reinforcing antitrust and competition policies. In other words, letting the market act on some corporations that may not be viable because they don't have enough market share, that because they are not international competitive. Uh, that's the first uh, requirement for continuing with this approach of growth and fight against inequality simultaneously. And the second element is to keep expanding the coverage and quality of education, especially for the poor. So, this investment in education is a sure way to improving the living standards of people. And again, this is not something that is totally new. In this, Latin America is following the example of the Asian tigers, who very early on, uh, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, uh, etc., invested in education to avoid the trap of cheap labor. Uh, the countries that I just mentioned used to attract international investment only because they were able to offer labor at a very affordable price uh, for international standards. But over time, because the workers had access to education, quality education, they were increasingly able to perform more demanding jobs, and therefore they were in a position of asking for better wages, and therefore the investment had to respect that the qualification of labor and bring the cheap jobs elsewhere. This pretty much happened in many countries of Latin America, especially as as I was mentioning, in Costa Rica that very early on invested in their own population, and therefore this kind of sustains the fight against inequality. Okay, I would. This is what I have to say. Maybe you have some comments and some questions. Again, I would encourage you to look at the slides that Peyton provided, and I'm hoping that Zach will send his slides soon, even if it's late already because the presentation is already made. But uh, because we cannot, take advantage of those slides live, at least you will have them uh, in e-class for um, to be consulted later on. So I see only two people that are connected now, but maybe any of you have a comment, a question, or you're good. Well, I don't see much reaction really. So then we'll meet again here on Tuesday, March 24th at 2 p.m. And I will try to present briefly the contents of this of next week's uh, lecture, while at the same time sharing Kale's slides that he promised to send by then. Okay, so you can contact me anytime by email. These are extraordinary times that require extraordinary measures. We'll try to adapt the best we can without making the quality of our learning experience suffer. But you have the material. We are in contact. So let me know if you need anything. Okay. All right, guys. So I'll leave it there, and hope to see you all, and your colleagues as well on Tuesday. All right. Take care. Stay safe. Bye.